Welcome so much, everyone, to this year's Outspoken event featuring Sonalee Rashatwar. My name is Vernita Sengupta. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm from the Office of Counseling. My office is Motion Activated Lights. Sorry about that. I'm with Counseling and Psychological Services. And we wanted to begin tonight's event with a couple comments as well as a land acknowledgement. First off, we do want to mention that we have a live transcription or closed captioning enabled. So you'll just need to click the button labeled live transcript on your screen to actually display them. As we mentioned, we wanted to take a few minutes to reflect on an Indigenous land and people acknowledgement. With respect to the land and people who preceded us, the University of North Carolina at Charlotte acknowledges that we are on colonized land traditionally belonging to the Catawba, Cheraw, Sugary, Wateree, and Waxhaw peoples, all of whom have stewarded this land throughout the generations. Before this land was colonized and named the city of Charlotte, it was used as a place of meeting and trade by a diverse group of Indigenous peoples, including the Catawba, Cherokee, Congaree, and Saponi. We also acknowledge that the greater Charlotte region has directly profited from the enslavement and forced labor of African people and their descendants. We recognize that knowing, naming, acknowledging, honoring the history of the land and the people is only the first step. We must support and listen to Indigenous and Black voices while continuing to address the policies and practices that perpetuate oppression. With that said, I will turn it over to you, Terry.
All right, thank you, Renita. Welcome, as Renita said. I am Terry Rhodes. I'm also a psychologist at CAPS, been here for a long time and have also been involved with Outspoken for a while. So I want to give you a little bit of history with Outspoken, and then I will turn it over to Cassie and Lexi to introduce Sonalee. So welcome to the Outspoken community space tonight as we continue in our virtual world of interactions. We have learned to adjust to seeing one another in these little boxes on the screen and continue to appreciate the times when we can be in closer contact. Outspoken Speaker Series started 15 years ago on this campus as an event to increase awareness for LGBTQ issues on campus, to support queer identified speakers, and to try to move our campus climate to a more affirming, inclusive space for staff, students, faculty, queer and otherwise. Outspoken was a powerful idea of Dr. Coral Wayland, who is a past program chair for Women's and Gender Studies, and one of the biggest allies on campus, as far as I'm concerned. She really embodies the role of ally, and we're so grateful to her for her vision and initiative in creating the Outspoken Speaker Series. This project sought to align Women's and Gender Studies, the Counseling Center, and the Office for Identity, Equity, and Engagement, formerly MRC, to combat the heterosexism, sexism, genderism, racism on our campus, and to work towards a more diverse and equitable, inclusive campus. We are so proud of the shifts and experiences associated with Outspoken, and truly believe that our campus is a more diverse, just, and inclusive community, in part because of the series. Outspoken is, for the second year, virtual, online, due to our continuing to manage our lives in this virtual, more distant place. The pandemic has shone a light on long-standing inequities and disparities for BIPOC and queer folks in our communities. Notably illuminating the systemic racism that underlies the racial violence and inequities that permeate our world, and also noting the continuing attacks on queer people's rights and humanity, specifically queer and trans folks of color. We're fortunate this year to have a speaker for Outspoken who speaks on salient issues that impact our lives as queer people and the importance of emphasizing the intersections of queer and gender identities, size, and body integrity, and race. Outspoken is a timely event in our community since hard-fought gains for queer and racial justice are being eroded away. Welcome to Sonalee's cat. uh, eroded away by the systemic inequities of racism, misogyny, sexism, and heterosexism. We hope to identify and discuss the interlocking systems of oppression that are fueled by these hateful politics in our current culture. Queer people, people of color, women, and trans folks live every day with these constant stressors impinging on our lives and our ability to live free from oppressive systems. While LGBTQ speakers come to Charlotte, and while we have courses that focus on queer issues, Outspoken really institutionalizes, validates, makes visible LGBTQ programming on a large scale and demonstrates the university's commitment, hopefully, to queer students, faculty, and staff. Additionally, Outspoken is a public event and available to the broader community, which is one of the objectives of Outspoken. We really want to continue to connect in with a greater Charlotte community. This helps us to give student leaders the opportunity to have some of those liaisons. Through Outspoken, queer identified students have had the opportunity to identify with queer role models, to engage in campus conversations and open dialogues with some unlikely groups, and to really shift our campus culture in important ways. Our campus is safer, more affirming, and inclusive place for all of us. So I want to acknowledge some of the support that we've had over the past 15 years. And it's really a little bit unbelievable to me that it's been 15 years. We've had multiple Chancellor Diversity grants. We've had other grants from the campus community and other other community grants. All of the support people from the wonderful folks in Women's and Gender Studies and other campus departments, the LGBTQ faculty and staff group, and all the students over the past 15 years that have been added to make these efforts work. This is an amazing speaker series. We look forward to the queer identified power that speakers bring to our campus, and including tonight. And just to highlight a couple of the folks that we've had on our campus in the past 14 years. We've had a wonderful representative group of queer identified speakers, trans, non-binary, gender expansive, lesbian, gay, queer people of color, artists, photographers, filmmakers, poets, political commentators, and even a gay football player who is now actually running for office, political office in Pennsylvania. So we started our speaker series with Kate Bornstein, who is a wonderful trans activist, moved into some other kind of political speakers. We've had a speaker who was part of the Clinton administration, so from a political perspective there, a filmmaker. We've had a comic trans activist who was an actor on Transparent, Ian Harvey, a lovely photographer who brought a lot of wonderful kind of photography into our campus for us to see, for people that identified as queer and Muslim. We have had a Julio Salgado, who calls himself an undocu queer activist. And last year we had a speaker, Rhea Chapman, who was also a social worker. So maybe we're starting a trend here, Sonalee, with social workers and being a part of the speaker series. So I wanted to just sort of provide a little bit of context for people, so you know about Outspoken and where it came from, and hopefully some of the power of it. I'm going to shift to the student introducers. So Cassie and Lexi are going to do more of the introductions and some of the logistical pieces, and introduce Sonalee more directly. So welcome, and thank you all for coming.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cassie Pagan. I'm a senior here at UNC Charlotte studying health systems management with a double minor in psychology and women's and gender studies. We're very excited that you could join us today. I know you are thrilled to have Sonalee Rashatwar here with us virtually. A number of groups made Sonalee's visit today possible, and we would like to take a minute to acknowledge their support. We would first like to thank the Chancellor's Diversity Challenge Fund for providing the major support for this event. We would also like to thank our other generous sponsors, Counseling and Psychological Services, the Women and Gender Studies Counseling Program, in the Office of Identity, Equity, and Engagement, and Gen X. And of course, we would also like to acknowledge the work and support of the Volunteer Committee of Students and Faculty for hosting the series for the last 15 years. I would like to all to pay attention to Zoom call etiquette and remain muted unless otherwise invited to interact directly. You're welcome to chat, and we'll try to keep up with the questions submitted in the chat. Please note that we will provide a link at the end of the talk for you to complete an evaluation form. We use this feedback when planning other Outspoken events, and we can use this completed form to document attendance for those seeking credit for attending Outspoken tonight. To complete this evaluation following the program this evening, this will only take a minute. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lexi, and I'm an alumni and former Women and Gender Studies minor. And as you may know, Outspoken, which is celebrating its 15th anniversary this year, is an annual speaker series on the UNC Charlotte campus, showcasing LGBT speakers and creating a forum for discussion of LGBT issues. This year, Outspoken will host Sonalee Rashatwar, who utilizes the pronouns they and he, and is popularly known as the Fat Sex Therapist on Instagram, and is an award-winning clinical social worker, sex therapist, lecturer, and grassroots organizer based in Philadelphia. He describes himself as a super fat, queer, bisexual, non-binary therapist, and is co-owner of Radical Therapy Center, a center specializing in treating sexual trauma, diet trauma, racial or immigrant trauma, and South Asian family abuse, while also offering fat-positive sexual health care. Sonalee is a community organizer where they have fundraised and facilitated a free 5-day political action summer camp for LGBT, South Asian and Indo-Caribbean youth. Sonalee received their Master of Social Work and Master of Education in Human Sexuality from Widener University. His work focuses on disability justice and healthism, decolonizing sexualities, and fat-positive wellness. The title of their program tonight is How Fat Queers the Body, Unpacking Influences of Racism, Heterosexism, Cissexism, and Colonialism on Body Image. And some examples of previous events Sonalee has presented include Why Fat-Positive Healthcare. This was in 2020, University of Illinois. Understanding the white supremacist origins of fat phobia, the gender abolition of fatness, models of pride conference, describing the unwritten, how Asians can show up for Black lives, using disability justice to disrupt fat phobia and counseling, and in collaboration with All Body Sex Education, Unlearning Fat Phobia and Healing Body Image. This program will seek to examine the role of racism, heterosexism, cissexism, and colonialism in the creation of cultural standards of beauty, and will speak to our collective change-making spirit to create a world in which all bodies and people are affirmed and celebrated. It is my honor and privilege to present to everyone this year's Outspoken keynote speaker, Sonalee Rashatwar.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Sonalee Rashatwar, and I have prepared for you a lot of ideas behind how and why fat queers the body. I am a person known to the world as the fat sex therapist. I have been stopped in the airport while on vacation at a grocery store in Miami because someone was touched by my work. I feel really privileged to be a person in the world, an adult in the world, who I needed as a kid. And so I come to this work as the very hurt child who very much still lives within me, who needed an adult to tell them that their body was good enough as it was. My work as the fat sex therapist in the world exists at this really unique intersection in understanding the very small ways that diet culture and rape culture intersect, and therefore how our healing as people who have been doubly harmed. I say this as a person who experienced sexual violence at a young age, and also diet trauma at a young age. In order to heal from those two things, the healing actually looks pretty similar. healing from sexual violence and healing from diet trauma require really similar tools, which is a unique thing that I've learned through working in the field for about 10 years now. So I bring to you ideas. I bring to you like theory that I've invented. And if you are a person in the world who exists like me at this like really unique intersection of identities, you can create theory too. It's literally made up. All these ideas I'm showing you today come from other people's works that I have read, that I really feel strongly about. But these connections are tenuous because they're part of like a theory that I'm trying to assemble. And so today, I want to have a conversation around how fat queers the body. And we're going to use some lenses to understand how fat queers the body through race, class, and gender really specifically. Now, we only have like an hour together. And so it was really hard for me to find like just an hour of content for you. So I've totally over prepared, but don't worry. You're going to get a copy of the slides and I'm actually going to put them in the chat right now. So you have the slides in case we don't get to all of them. If you're curious for more content, since we only have such little time together, you can always find more on my Instagram at the Fat Sex Therapist. And should you ever need to reach out to me for some reason, you can contact me on my website, and that's sonaleeart.com. If this is our first time meeting, it's a pleasure to meet you. I identify personally to myself as an artist, and I make lots of really silly, bad art. I'm trying to find one right now for you. This was a coloring book page that sits on my desk. That's just colored. And I identify as an artist because I just color in coloring books. I really want us to like dismantle this notion that like being an artist means something really specific. Because actually, if we undid that expectation, probably a lot more of us would consider ourselves artists. I also consider myself a fat futurist. And this term actually builds upon the vast body of work of Afrofuturism. And for me, my fat futurism is simply, I want fat people to exist in the future. And I want us to have pleasurable, shame-free lives. So it's like a really simple thing. It sounds really small and nice and you know, happy, but it would actually require the destruction of multi-billion-dollar industries in order for fat people to have pleasurable, shame-free lives. And we're going to talk about what I mean even when I say that. I come to this work as someone who has survived childhood sexual abuse, sexual violence in adulthood, and diet trauma starting at a really young age. And I think that's something that's really unique that I bring to my work is I will use examples from my own life and connect it to theory. And I think that's something that a lot of marginalized folks in the world do. Marginalized clinicians, marginalized educators. And it's an incredible skill to be able to do that. It's also really hard to do that. It's hard to talk about things that you've survived and then do it with like a smile. It's hard to do that. I'm also a clinical social worker based in Philly, so not too far from y'all. I have lots of friends and family who live in North Carolina, very sweet memories of North Carolina. And in Philly, I'm known as someone who co-owns and works at Radical Therapy Center. What we do that's really different at Radical Therapy Center is we are a small practice of clinicians, social workers mostly, who politicize therapy. And so what that looks like for us is we bring conversations about systems of oppression into the clinical office. So when I'm working with a client who's struggling with feeling lazy on a Sunday and just letting themselves be lazy, so like not catch up on chores, not do any schoolwork, just watch Netflix all day, not even shower or brush your teeth, only leave the couch to go to the bathroom. Maybe you're not even using the food that's in the fridge, you're just ordering takeout. When we feel shame about those things, sometimes that's productivity shame, and it can be a symptom of internalized capitalism. And that happens when we internalize this idea that capitalism teaches us that our bodies are just machines, they're just tools for constant production. And if we're not producing something, if we're not making progress on something, then we are bad and our body is bad. So that's what we do. It's a little bit different at Radical Therapy Center. Before we get into any content, I know that we actually, what a lot of y'all might not know is that we had some hiccups in how we had to even word this presentation today, and how we were even going to package it and offer it as a conversation. We had to eliminate terms around white supremacy because they were like red flags, and possibly because they were connected to critical race theory in the ways that it's currently been banned in your state, which is a conversation that's happening across the US. And so I felt like I had to at least mention that we are going to be talking about topics that would exist under the umbrella of critical race theory today. And the reason that there is even a national dialogue around it is because, and I'll read this tweet here by Naomi Simmons Thorne. Our school system is designed to baptize the youngest members of our society into all the American mythologies that are needed to sustain and reproduce our white supremacist, imperialist, and capitalist society. The attack on critical race theory is not that at all. It's an attack on critical consciousness and education. And so this conversation that I prepared for us tonight is absolutely a conversation on critical consciousness. And so I have to remind us that if feelings come up while we have this conversation tonight, I as a clinician have to kind of give you this yield sign, warning, reminder, that's supposed to happen. If we are actually going to undo these ways that we are secretly baptized into white supremacy, then we have to kind of uproot like weeds from our garden, the places that these ideas were planted years ago. And so I like to ground our conversation in the work of Black radicalism, because fat liberation is impossible without Black liberation. What James Baldwin reminds us is that the role of the artist is exactly the same as the role of the lover. If I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things that you don't see. And so the reason that I get hired to do these workshops, especially with students, is because I have this interesting way of showing us what we often don't see with fat phobia, and how it is really linked to so many other systems like white supremacy, anti-Blackness, ableism, and a multi-billion-dollar diet industry worldwide. So let's get cracking. This is kind of like my warning. Feelings are going to happen. And it's okay if feelings happen for you. If you're like, oh shit, I might have said something like that before to a friend, and that was actually fat phobic. It's okay. I don't want you to get stuck in the shame of that. I want us to remember that we have all been indoctrinated into fat phobia, and we get bombarded with those messages all the time. Every time we open a magazine, turn on Netflix, or listen to the radio or Spotify. And it's okay. We all get indoctrinated into it. Our job now is, how do we uproot it? How do we remove it? How do we think a different way? So what does it even mean to queer something? Our conversation tonight is, how does fat queer the body? And so I do want to offer us a moment in the chat box in case anyone has an idea. What does it even mean to queer something? Or when have you ever heard someone use the word queer as a verb? To put it out of the ordinary. That's a really great way to put that. I see queer as simply to dismantle the binary. Oof, I love that too. Really actionable. Queer as to resist. Excellent. I love these verbs. Great synonyms. I see it really similarly. And queer is to liberate myself. Oh, these are like poems that you're writing in the chat, by the way. Really beautiful. I see queer often used as a way for us to do exactly what Ryan said, to talk about binaries. And so let's use it in a sentence. In this tweet by Seher, they write that, and they use queer in a sentence, which I think is really interesting. Friendship versus romance is a binary. You can release if you want to. More queering of relational space. We've got a lot more than just two options. Queering in this instance, I feel, is like this fuzzying of a binary or a line. It's like this troubling of something that often gives us opposites or only two choices. And queering, if you're looking for a more literal definition, it can just be the act of taking something, a concept, and looking at it through a lens that makes it strange or troubles it. So it's almost like if you say the word fork 100 times and you're like, what even is the meaning of fork? It sounds so weird. The word loses its meaning, right? It just sounds like a weird tone, weird sound. And so what I want us to do today with fatness is to queer, to really like look at the word fat, to analyze fatness as a concept and try to trouble where it gets such negative stigma, where it gets such negative connotation. To take queering a step further, I feel like we have to use this quote by Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks, whose name it feels like synonymous with feminism. Queer not as being about who you're having sex with, that can be a dimension of it, but queer as being about the self that is at odds with everything around it and has to invent, create, and find place to speak and thrive and to live. In this case, I see fatness as constantly at odds with the world around it. My fatness feels at odds because I am interacting with people. I'm interacting with doctors and nurses in doctors' offices who tell me that my fatness is not something that should exist. I'm interacting with clothing manufacturers and online retailers who tell me that there's a limit to what size people they want wearing their fashion and their art. That is at odds with whether or not my body feels acceptable enough to be adorned and decorated like thin bodies are. My fat self is at odds when I had to take a plane ride last week to a gig at Cal Poly on the West Coast. And the arm rails were digging into my legs, and it's a 5-hour flight. So it's pretty much a guarantee that I will leave with bruises on my legs and on my sides. So in this sense, like my fat body, my fatness has a literal experience of being at odds with everything that is around it. And what fat people are often called to do is to create many worlds. We have to invent them, we have to create them, we have to find them where we can speak and thrive and live. And so that means having friend groups that accept our fat body and don't continue engaging in diet talk, creating and influencing family spaces that feel safer, romantic and sexual relationships, if that's something that we're interested in, that also, again, accommodate not just our physical body, but like all of the needs that we have, emotional needs to take care of that fat body. And so tonight I'm going to offer us 3 specific lenses on how to think about fatness queering the body. We're going to talk about this through a race lens, through a class lens, and a gender lens. My most favorite article to talk about how fat queers the body is this article by Hunter Shackelford. This article was actually published in 2016, and they did not use they them pronouns back then, but they do now. So it just goes to show you like how gender is fluid, just like sexual orientation. And what Hunter talks about in this article is how when they grew up as a young fat kid, a young fat girl, that fatness in itself had this queering effect. And so I'm going to read to you some of the quotes that I pulled from this article that make it literally chef's kiss, because they talk about how fat queers the body through race, class, and gender. So they talk about how when they grew up as a young fat Black girl, they were treated as one of the boys because they were not considered feminine enough. And in order to be feminine, you were seen as innocent and controllable. That their proximity to girlhood was limited because of their Blackness and fatness. And they were always othered because of this. They saw and understood that femininity itself was significantly scripted through whiteness and thinness. So in order to be feminine, one would have to be more light skinned, one would have to be closer to whiteness, and also thinness. Thinness itself becomes a beauty ideal of white supremacy. As a young Black fat girl, they were forced to shop in boys' and men's department in order to find clothing. And this itself was a queering of gender, because their fatness had this non-conforming gender quality. Girls' bodies at that time, they were told that we're supposed to be petite and small because femininity is supposed to be controllable under the male gaze, under the cishet male gaze. In order to be seen as more feminine, they would have to buy more feminine clothing, but that clothing wasn't even available in their size. And so any kind of girlhood or womanhood that they might have even wanted could not have even been accessible because it wasn't available in their size. Their performance of gender was constantly policed. They would be told that they would have to close their legs or tone policed because they were seen as too aggressive and angry. Again, we see race show up here. And anytime they felt hypofeminine, it was validated. Their hypofemininity was validated when teachers, administrators would not see them as a potential victim or someone who could be harmed, and therefore was not being defended or protected by people who had power in a classroom. And therefore, Hunter had to constantly defend themselves from mean classmates. This article really summarizes very succinctly how gender itself is scripted through white supremacy, through a thin, delicate, innocent, controllable feminine body. The beauty standard is set, the gender standard is also set. The temperament is set, and anyone who exists outside of that is seen as not a perfect victim, not worthy of protecting by adults, not worthy of clothing, not worthy of being comforted or soothed when harmed by others. And how anti-Blackness was a really important part of this entire narrative. And we're going to delve into this deeper because the US origins of fat phobia that we have here today are absolutely rooted in anti-Blackness. It has to be said, and for anyone else who's in the room who is also non-binary, there are these goalposts, there are these body ideals that are still handed to us as non-binary individuals. We are told similarly how Hunter was told in childhood that their young girl body, their young Black girl body was not feminine enough because it was not thin enough. And in the same way, non-binary folks are also told the same thing, that we cannot achieve androgyny, we cannot achieve non-binariness if we are not thin. And this is because what Hunter mentioned earlier in the article, because quite literally fatness queers the body. Fatness has a warping effect on our bodies. And so a body that might want to appear feminine when it has fat on it might appear masculine. When a masculine body wants to appear masculine, when a body that wants to appear masculine has fat on it, fat can feminize that body. And when a non-binary body has fat on it, when it wants to appear ungendered, it can have a gendering experience. This is specifically from a lens, a white supremacist lens of bodies, where fatness itself has a queering effect on the body. It should not. My theory is that it should not necessarily have a queering effect on our bodies. That if fatness was seen as normal, healthy, natural, a part of body size diversity, that we would not see this effect. We would actually see fatness as a necessary part of ourselves in order to keep ourselves warm in the winter, or makes us really good at hugging or cuddling babies, or being an armrest when someone is taking a road trip, or a nap rest. If we saw fatness as necessary and good, we would not have this gendering effect on the body. Further, what we see through Alok's research, if you're familiar with Alok, or if you're not familiar, they are a brilliant cultural worker and like fashion designer and thinker in the world. They are on Instagram, and they published a book report on this book, Manliness and Civilization. It's an older book, it's been around for a while, but basically I wanted to add this. Rufus, what we're talking about thus far is how femininity is largely scripted through the thin, white, feminine body. And that is because gender roles themselves, gender itself, is a construct that was invented by white supremacy. These ideas of man and woman, or that man being so different from woman, or that man and woman existing in every culture is an invention of white supremacy. And in this book, Manliness and Civilization, Alok talks about gender being a racial construct, and how specifically what we see in the US is this form of American masculinity that it has been taught to us as the epitome of racial evolution, that racial evolution has successfully created the peak of what we see here in the US as American masculinity. And it has to be said that we're talking about a white supremacist masculinity here when we're talking about American masculinity. In this book, Manliness and Civilization, it talks about how this idea of civilization, to like civilize someone, so like the verb of de-savaging someone, is really used to naturalize, to make normal cis heteropatriarchy and white supremacy. It talks about in this book how anti-Black policing was invented as taught to us as necessary in order to advance the white race. It made laws inaccessible by those that the law deemed other or deemed as savage. That in this book, it talks about how civilized races were invented, and that in this hierarchy of whiteness and Blackness, whiteness and white supremacy invented this concept that there should be only two genders, and that the two genders have a deep divide between body size, that men are big and muscular and strong, and women are small and petite and delicate. In this book, it also argues that white men have an inherent genocidal urge that needs to be expressed. It's supposed to be there, it deserves to be there, and it needs to be expressed. And we see this connection show up with who is really interested in Second Amendment laws, and also like hunting as a sport. When it becomes like a personality trait, when it becomes like someone's like banner cause. What's really tricky about this though is that eugenesis, I mean, all of it's tricky, the whole entire concept, but where it becomes dangerous in implementation is that eugenicists use a lot of these ideas around what defines gender norms to determine who deserves to die and who doesn't deserve access to things like adequate medical care. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But when we talk about patriotism, one thing that I really want us to connect back to is how this also connects to that white supremacist American masculinity. We often see patriotism, the backing of like US imperialism, the army, US empire, and I don't know if we always make the connection to like toxic masculinity, and how these things are besties, white supremacy and toxic masculinity. So this is a great book to check out if you're interested to understand more about how white supremacy itself created this idea of thinness and whiteness being used as a script for femininity. If we delve a little bit deeper into diet culture, I feel like this is the classic image that I use to teach about what diet culture even is. And if you can, write in the chat box, like, what are you even seeing in this image? We see someone trying to lose weight, that we can only achieve these things if we're thin, and that these things are essentially unattainable. The person will never get those things, they're out of reach. And in order to find happiness and love, one must be in shape and lose weight. You all are getting exactly the points that I'm trying to pick out here. What really happens in this image is we get dehumanized by diet culture. You can kind of see the image if you like were to zoom out a little bit. It looks like the way that you can trick a donkey into moving forward by dangling a carrot at the end of a stick, right? That carrot is never going to be attained. That donkey is never going to actually get that carrot. But diet culture really dehumanizes us by getting us to feel like love, happiness, success, and confidence are things that we earn, that we have to like punish ourselves, restrict ourselves to earn those things. And worse yet, diet culture sells us this fantasy, this intangible fantasy and ranking system. It teaches us how to rank ourselves and other people based on whether or not they are also participating in this like diet culture rat race. And it tells us that like, if I'm doing a good job at this diet culture rat race, then I'm allowed to shit on other people who aren't. I'm allowed to make fun of them. I'm allowed to tease them. I'm allowed to tell them that they're doing a bad job. I'm allowed to use shame to control them in the way that diet culture uses shame to control me. And so I have to mention that within diet culture, it creates a binary between thinness and fatness. And thin people still experience violence under diet culture. It might be less than fat people, but thin people still have to contort their bodies and their brains and their eating habits into these like terrible shapes in order to also be receiving less violence than the fat people at the bottom of that social hierarchy. And so diet culture, to me, it just really epitomizes this image here that you're looking at. And it's using a white woman's body or a white person's body. We don't really know this person's gender. But I think that that's really on purpose in the way that I interpret it, because within the US, we are taught, as a non-white person, I am taught that a white woman's beauty standards is the epitome of everyone's beauty standards. And if I get closer to a white woman's beauty standard, then that is good for me because I can be more proximal to white supremacist beauty. But what is so dangerous about a lot of diet culture, it's not just like that our body is going through distress because we are starving it. What Virgie Tovar is a complicated person in the fat liberation world. So I just have to give you that disclaimer before I read the quote. But what she tells us is that dieting is about even more than weight loss. It's about estranging you from your body. It's about untethering you from what your body is trying to tell you about what you need and what you want. It's about engaging and preoccupying you in an impossible project of conformity. This is what my parents were trying to condition me into when I was put on non-consensual diets from a really young age. Non-consensual diets are a term that I came up with because of my analysis of power and abuse and growing up in an abusive family. When my parents were telling me that my body wasn't good enough while it was going through puberty and it was supposed to change, it was supposed to gain all this weight and look like, you know, the way puppies do, you know, they get wide and then they get long and then they get wide and then they get long. You know, human kids go through the same thing. And when my parents were telling me that, because I can remember the memory just very explicitly sitting in the dining room table, kitchen table, and they told me I would not be taken seriously in my career if I stayed fat. I would have a hard time finding a man to marry me, and I would have a hard time having biological children, which we don't even know if the biological children one is true. I mean, none of them are true. But what they were telling me was that if I didn't change my body to fit into what white supremacy considers successful, that and they were giving me the best tools they had as like my immigrant parents who came from India in their like 10s and 20s. They were trying to tell me that you have to conform if you're going to succeed within capitalism, that it's going to be like a brutal system. People are not going to treat you well. And they had actually like a really vivid, clear understanding of structural and systemic fat phobia, as they were both brown fat people. And they were telling me that if I don't conform, I won't be successful. And my body, as a fat person, I know you can't see me, but like I'm a fat person, I promise. There's like a whole fat body over here. I'm a super fat person. I wear a size 28 pants. And what I am so grateful for is that my body resisted. My body basically said, no, every diet you try, it is not going to work. You know, I was among the 95 to 97% of dieters who fail at weight loss. So intentional weight loss and dieting has a failure rate of 95 to 97%. It's very close to 100. And I'm so grateful of my body for failing because it bought me time. If my body was successful at changing body size, I would have been expected to get married pretty soon after college. That would have been my early 20s. And my parents were trying to get me married like even in my late teens, so that I could be someone else's burden, like another man's burden instead of my father's. And what staying fat did was it bought me my 20s. Like, and I'm still single in my 30s, and I'm like so protective of it. Because it gave me time to figure out my sexual orientation, my gender identity, gave me time to figure out all the feelings I've been carrying that have been unprocessed from my childhood. Staying fat really got me off of that highway of conformity so that I could have the time to decide for myself what I even wanted, when I was often being told what I should want and what I should need. Because what diet culture does is it untethers us from ourselves so that we can't hear ourselves. We can't hear our intuition. We can't hear our sexual or our non-sexual hungers. And so we will tell ourselves, I can't trust myself. My hunger is too big. I couldn't possibly know what I want. And so I should listen to someone with more authority, who's older than me, who has more power than me. They might know better. And when we give ourselves enough time, actually, we come home to ourselves. And so that's one of the big lessons that I want us to take away from this conversation. I jump into a fat phobic slur because now we're heading into the conversation of, you know, what are the anti-Black origins of fat phobia? Let's use the lens of race to understand how fat queers the body. Also, I want to check on time, Terry. Do we have until 7?
We do, but let's go beyond that if we want to. So, I mean, it's almost 7 now, so let's go beyond that a little bit if you'd like to.
Yeah, maybe I'll finish up these like 3 or 4 slides on anti-Blackness and see where everyone else is feeling. Has anyone ever heard someone say this phrase to them? And if you had, just let me know in the chat. Has anyone ever said this to you? Well, our ancestors weren't obese. Oh, someone has said this. Oh, unfortunately, right? Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Oh, wow. So many of you. Usually it's just me whenever I ask a room of people, by the way. So I'm like shocked, but also horrified. Usually someone says this to me like moments before they're about to tell me about their like keto or paleo diet, right? So this is something that's often said before someone tries to talk about how they presume stereotypically people once ate, right? Like cave people. And I intentionally use this word obese because this is a word that I do not use as a fat person. So anyone who's listening tonight, if this is the first time you've ever heard, obese is actually considered a slur, an anti-fat slur. And obese is considered an anti-fat slur because it really assumes fatness as diseased and bad and abnormal. And it's often used as a term in like doctor's offices where fat people are put on, their fatness is like on the stand. And we're like, fatness is fighting for its life in order to exist. So don't use the term obese, or actually I don't use the term overweight either. I just like to use the word fat, and I like to use it like really positively and flowery, like the honeyed, beautiful word that it is. What I hate about this statement though, well, our ancestors weren't obese, is that it's historically inaccurate. These images, these sculptures, are some of the oldest sculptures known to humankind. All of these people look fat to me. And if in any way they emulated the types of bodies that existed at that time, to me, indicate that fat people did exist. And what's really scary about this statement, well, our ancestors weren't fat, it really normalizes eugenics. Because in this really simple statement, it says, well, fat people didn't exist in the past, so they shouldn't exist today, and they shouldn't exist in the future. And that's actually really messed up. We should not like eugenics because eugenicists are race scientists and Nazi scientists and invested in white supremacy. This thumbnail is used in an article written by Heslov. It's a great article, definitely recommend you check it out. In it, she connects white supremacy, colonialism, and fat phobia. And in this article, she uses an image of a naked Black person. And so I'm just gonna say that twice to give everyone like an emotional heads up that that's the image that's coming next. So in this article, Heslov uses an image of a naked Black person. And this person may be presumed to be a Black woman, but we don't know this person's gender. And so you're gonna see an image pop up in just another second of this person standing in profile. And so in this image, all you can see is a Black person standing in profile who is in a fat body. And the only information we have about who this person is the information of who took the photo. That it was a photo taken by an actual, like a colonizer, Napoleon Bonaparte, and it was taken in the late 1800s. That is the only information we have about this image, which to me is very problematic because it tells us that this image was used for colonizing purposes, for promoting and creating visuals that support white supremacy. What Hess talks about in the production and the proliferation of images like this is she talks about this construction of the idea of fat bodies. And she says that the idea of fat immobile bodies was invented this concept that they drain society, they're a drain on society and need to be eradicated. It's concurrent and congruent with the idea that Black bodies are a burden and need to be eradicated. Since they cannot rid the world of large bodies, they'll attempt to colonize our understanding of those bodies and continue to push Blackness into an infinite abyss. For all their revisionist attempts, Black fatness has always been here and is here to stay. So she talks about how this mythology was invented really intentionally, that in order to prop up white supremacy, an opposite had to be invented and created. In order to invent white superiority, we had to invent an enemy, invent an opposite. And Hess talks about the invention of Blackness and fatness as the opposite of white superiority, that Blackness had to be created as inferior. And so she talks about how fatness was a really important part of creating this opposite between whiteness and Blackness. That in order for whiteness to be superior, they really tied thinness to it, and the food that created thinness, and the temperament that thin white people had. Even though there were fat white people and thin Black people, right? We've seen many people of many body sizes and races. But this stereotype and mythology was intentionally invented to create a binary between whiteness and Blackness, so that one was better than the other. The work of Dr. Sabrina Strings in Fearing the Black Body further elaborates on how many other aspects of white supremacy were invented in order to prop up this myth of white superiority, relying on fat phobia to prop up that myth. And so she talks about and cites the existence of human zoos, the creation of Enlightenment era art, and also like the production of diet food as things that were really necessary to create this invention of white superiority. She talks about how Enlightenment era art, and we're seeing like this 1600s to 1800s range, this is when capitalism was really being invented. We are seeing the proliferation of and kidnapping of enslaved Africans. We are seeing the promotion of race and white supremacist science and reason, intellectual. They're using the word exchange, but it's often theft, because we had scientists in Asia, Africa, Middle East, coming up with things like arithmetic and different aspects of science that were often being plagiarized and stolen and then promoted, published as white science. But also at this time was also the height of race science, white supremacist science. Human zoos also saw their height in creating and inventing the savage or the other, creating this binary between civilized versus savage, as if either of those existed. And we also saw the invention and creation of diet foods. This dude, Sylvester Graham, actually invented the graham cracker. And he, in the US, thought that the graham cracker would prevent masturbation in children. Like really weirdly was obsessed with like whether children masturbated, like very weird. And he thought that graham crackers would prevent that. He thought that he was connecting that a food would change behavior. A food would change the way that we operate in our body. It would make our body good or bad. We really saw this connection between food moralism in this really unique flavor here in the US. And Sylvester Graham was a big part of that. And you see, again, his age range, late 1700s, like mid 1800s. He was a dietary reformer. The type of vegetarianism that we see in the US is actually really deeply rooted in food moralism too. This idea that the way I eat can communicate that I'm a better person than someone else because of this like seemingly arbitrary decision. And that's not to say that a lot of vegetarians or vegans do it, but some people do. Some people do say, I'm a better person because of this way that I eat. And this is really connected to the food moralism that Sylvester Graham brought over to the US. And so I'm going to stop on this slide for a minute and just check in with everybody. A lot of what I'm talking about today is the anti-Black origins of fat phobia. And I've been tossing around the word white supremacy a lot. But I really wanted to remind us that white supremacy isn't just like the KKK. It's not guys in hoods with torches. It's the assumption that how white people traditionally do things is normal and right, and how other people do things is weird and wrong. And at its simplest form, that's all white supremacy is. And so I want to encourage us to actually get into the habit of using the term white supremacy more often to describe more things, because it is actually such a mundane term that we should be more comfortable using all the time. And more importantly, what we are experiencing today as diet culture is not a part of the colonial past. There's only an ongoing colonial present. So colonialism wasn't a moment in time, it's actively still happening. A lot of the diet culture that we are seeing today is still remnants of like active white supremacy. And we see that in the ways that we constantly signal to other people how we're eating and how people should treat us based on how we're eating. So I mentioned a couple of sentences back that a lot of how we eat is often like quietly signaling to other people how to treat us. And so this tweet by Caleb Luna, I think, really summarizes it well. What they say is that they feel less interested in thinking about the price of organic foods and fruits and veggies as reasons for why poor and fat people don't eat them. And they're more interested in how the price of produce or pricings produce certain foods as class markers that keep wealthy people invested, and thinness by proxy as class performance. So what they're talking about is how if certain foods that are valued as healthy and good cost more, this actually makes them inaccessible to poor folks, right? And therefore makes the project of performing good health, being able to access good health, also inaccessible to anyone who can't afford it. And therefore thinness, someone who can achieve thinness, who can even like change their body size, which like I mentioned is a really small percentage of people, also a part of class performance. We actually see this example embodied in the show Frasier. I get that y'all are like university undergrad students, and so maybe you're not familiar with this show, but it's one of my favorite shows. And that's because it like really pokes fun at like rich, snobby white people. And in this show, there's a character whose entire purpose is like constantly working on the project of her body. We don't even see her. She's like one of those characters who's like is often referenced in the show in the dialogue, but we never actually see the character. And the character is Maris. That's Niles's wife. Niles is the man on the far left with the yellow tie. And in this show, they really constantly are signaling to other people that this character, Maris, who we never see, is, you know, always like off to some place to have like, for example, and this is a real example, to have fat sucked out of her elbows. So like as if a body part that really like doesn't really possess fat, right? It's a bone, it's a joint, to have fat removed from that body part. And what's happening in the show is they're often covertly communicating food moralism and body moralism. And so this is a great article by the Fat Nutritionist where she talks about food moralism and kind of breaks it down for us that like, if we ever find ourselves getting stuck calling food good or bad, where we are getting caught up in this binary. And she says that the only type of food that's actually bad is food that is spoiled or it's contaminated with botulism. But even then, if we were to accidentally eat spoiled food or food that was contaminated with botulism, and let's say we got sick from it, we don't generally assume that person to now become a bad and contaminated person. But we do this with things that are considered unhealthy foods or bad foods or fattening foods. And in this article, she talks about how there is this like moral contamination that comes with eating bad foods, foods that are considered high calorie, presumably fattening. And the people who eat them are considered bad, gluttonous, ignorant, irresponsible, and usually low class. What's often what we see happening more recently is the way that fast food and processed food and the hatred of those types of food are often used as a vehicle to hate poor people. So anytime we see someone really shitting on fast food and processed food, we are forgetting that it doesn't just take a lot of money to eat well, it also takes time to eat well. And these things are limited, especially for those who are not rich, who can't simply hire someone to shop for that food, to prepare that food, to clean that food, to keep it in the fridge. It requires a lot in order to achieve this healthy lifestyle, this thin lifestyle. And it's supposed to be out of reach because it is used as a class status. So anytime you find yourself using a lot of these words to talk about food, we are actually getting caught up in food moralism. Because if we think about it, what does it even mean to eat clean? Are we eating snacks in the shower? Maybe, but maybe not. So anytime we're using words like clean, whole, good and bad, even natural, junk, earned, well-deserved, to be eaten in moderation, healthy, unhealthy, naughty, indulgent, sinful, dangerous, or tempting, we're actually leaning into this area where we're talking about food using this classed lens and this heavily moralized lens. And the morality, especially in the US, really comes from Christian supremacy and Christian colonialism. We see this in both of these, or in this tweet here on the left. Food has no moral value. It's not sinful or clean or guilt-free. You're not giving it a temptation by eating, you are taking in energy. So I did not grow up as a Christian person. I grew up as a Hindu. I was raised in a Hindu family. I have complicated feelings about religions, like let's not go on that topic. But I mentioned that because I feel like I've got a good eye for where Christian supremacy might have an influence here. And that's because I didn't really grow up with a concept of sin or temptation or like guilt in this exact way. And so we can see Christian colonial influences. Earlier we talked about the graham cracker, Sylvester Graham, but here we're seeing words like sin, we're seeing guilt, and we're seeing the word temptation. And a lot of these words are really used within Christian morality to talk about what is good or bad, and therefore how to treat ourselves based on the good or bad decisions that we're making. And so I want us to remember that nowadays, we often hear folks talk about health in the same way someone might have talked about their body 10 or 15 years ago. 10 or 15 years ago, folks would say, oh, I want to lose weight because I want to look better. They'll just be out front with why they're losing weight and that they value thinness more than fatness. But 10 to 15 years later, what we hear now is actually it's a lot more covert. People are like, I don't want to be perceived as someone who only values thinness. I will say, oh, I want to lose weight to be healthier. And these are actually identical statements. Wanting to lose weight for beauty or health, they're actually identical. Because health is not beauty. You can be both unhealthy and beautiful. Health is not morality. You can be unhealthy even if it's related to your own actions, and you can still be a good person. Health isn't worth. I can promise you that if you're unhealthy, you're still an important person. And so what is actually happening is we see a new type of moralism. We talked about food moralism, and it's kind of like morphed into health moralism, where we now treat people good or bad based on how healthy they are performing themselves to be. This often happens when we like yell at our friends who are smoking cigarettes. Do I support the tobacco industry? Obviously, no. I am not paid to say this by the tobacco industry. And the things that people choose to do with their bodies, they have a right to do that with their bodies, even if it looks unhealthy to people on the outside. And this is a really necessary part that I have to state as a fat person, because people will tell me until the cows come home that I should not stay fat, or that I should work as hard as I can to not be fat because being fat is unhealthy. And so I really have to decouple where we even get this like pressure to all of us need to be working on our health in the exact same way and for our bodies to look exactly the same way, because fat people do not owe anyone else in the world health. No one in the world owes anyone else health. Even like, what does that mean? It's such a nebulous term, and the goalpost is constantly changing. I want us to remember that a lot of these concepts were invented. So I want us to remember that the diet industry profits, at least in the US, 72 billion annually. 97% of diets don't work. Diet culture is a scam meant to manipulate us into hating our bodies so that someone can make money off of that self-hatred. And it's helpful for us to remember this because in this Vogue cover here, the question is, the way cellulite is the most meaningless thing. Who decided that was something to be insecure about? Like, it's fine, cellulite's fine. And the answer that Sid reminds us of is that it was Vogue. Vogue literally invented cellulite, or cellulite being something to be worried about. And there was a single issue in April 1968. Vogue became the first English language magazine and newspaper to print the term cellulite, literally invented as something for us to be worried about and for us to not like, and for us to consider it as unhealthy or an unfit aspect of our beauty. The number that was cited in the last slide was 72 billion. In 2019, the market was measured at 78 billion. This is just the US market. And we actually saw a decline in 2020 of the entire market, like declined, did very poorly by 21% in 2020. Can anyone guess why that's the case? In the chat box. People didn't go out, so they didn't feel bad about themselves. Yes, exactly. Like, it's so interesting how when we were put in quarantine, when we were alone with our thoughts, and we weren't actually engaging with other people's judgments or shame about our bodies, that the diet industry like failed by 21%. Like, it suffered by 21%. Like, that's so cool to me. And what sucks about this though is that the reports that I read, they're like, don't worry though, we're gonna have a record-making comeback in 2021. And we think that people going back to work is gonna skyrocket our industry, which sucks. Terry, I see your hand.
That was supposed to be a clap, sorry.
That's okay. What sucks about these numbers though is that they're expected to increase. So 78 billion is what just the US market represents, and this is the number from 2019. That's almost, it's not actually half, but it's like dangerously close to half of the entire global world market of weight loss products and services, which is like really alarming to me. And the number is looking to increase by like 50% by 2026, which is like hella alarming, but also should tell us that like, if 95 to 97% of intentional weight loss and diets fail, this industry is intentionally set up to have us feel shame about our body as it is. So we try a diet. The diet's going to fail almost 100% of the time. I'm going to blame myself for that diet failing. I'm going to feel so bad about it that maybe I'll buy another diet, and the cycle will start over again. And this is where it makes so much money. It's literally a scam. And so body acceptance, actually not intentionally losing weight can be that exit off of the highway of conformity that all of us need. And also, like, it might make the diet industry suffer. That's awesome. Lesson learned, diet and thinness is rooted in capitalism. Yes, also that, right? It's literally an industry that's a fake beauty standard that's fed to us. The same can be said about skincare. I'm so sorry, y'all, but like, skincare industry told that like we shouldn't age, we shouldn't have wrinkles, we shouldn't have sunspots, we shouldn't have acne, we shouldn't have like the appearance of anything on our skin. Like this is another beauty ideal that's sold to us that will spend lots of money based on our insecurity. So you can replace a lot of things with blank is a capitalist beauty standard. What's dangerous about this is that the people who are funding the science behind telling us being fat is unhealthy, the people funding that science and giving money to researchers is the weight loss industry. It makes me want to scoop my eyes out. This is a really great article that talks about neoliberalism, another big word, and fat phobia. If we were having another conversation on like health moralism, we would get more into this, but the companies that are often funding like the war on obesity and the science that like agrees with the war on obesity are Weight Watchers, Jenny Craig, Slim Fast, and pharmaceutical companies that produce weight loss drugs like Hoffman, La Roche, and Abbott Laboratories. I spy a conflict of interest, right? And so I wanted to offer you a model that I use to understand systemic fat phobia. Because what a lot of us understand maybe pretty well is internalized fat phobia. Like, okay, I have ingested this idea that my body is not good enough because it's bigger than it should be. And that's internalized fat phobia. Interpersonal, I'm communicating it to someone else. You know, I believe that thin bodies are more beautiful. And so I say something mean to someone else that I shouldn't say to communicate that fat phobia. What we often forget about, though, is institutional and structural fat phobia, which exist on more higher levels. And we forget about them because sometimes we have fewer examples to like spout off, but I'll just be quick about it because I'm looking at an example. An institution using a dress code. Oh, I think my internet connection was unstable, but we're back. School, an institution using a dress code with a double standard. Thin bodies get a different standard than fat bodies. Structural is when we see institutions talk to each other. So this is where we see weight loss industry fund the science, creating war on obesity rhetoric. And then these two institutions creating a system of power that then influences doctors. And doctors telling me that my fat body is unhealthy based on science that was funded by the diet industry, which directly benefits from me believing that my body is bad the way it is. So I will pause myself there and we'll do some Q&A.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And thanks, Sonalee. That was amazing. I feel like I learned so much. And I do know that we had a question while you were speaking. Ryan asked, can you speak a little bit on the creative processes you engaged in to help bring your varied interests surrounding these diverse and interesting topics, fatness, anti-racism, queerness, into cohesive thoughts and writings? Ryan shares so many of the same passions, but isn't sure how to organize their ideas to start creative journey in putting passions, interests into cohesive, terrifically written, curated content such as yours.
Oh my God. I will cry about that later. Thank you for such a good question. Such a sweetly worded question. To be honest, I don't know if I have a guidebook. I don't know if I have a good answer or like a succinct answer. But I think it started by someone asking me to do a workshop to teach on a concept, and then kind of having or sharing the way that my brain connects ideas. So you all got to actually see how my brain connects ideas in the way that is kind of roundabout. Like, I didn't tell you that fat phobia has, 4 distinct levels. I didn't tell you that these are the 3 laws of how fat queers the body, but I gave you a lot of examples so that maybe you could apply your own experience and vast knowledge set onto a couple of examples, and that you would pull out what you found, what threads you thought were interesting and had truth in them. So I think that the creative processes that I engage in include collage, they include writing, they include word mapping, and they include using art in order to think about how to connect ideas in a creative way. I also think using media that feels accessible is really important. So I know that I don't get my ideas from academic journals. I get my ideas from like people who tweet on the internet and like create awesome memes and art on the internet. And so when I share slides, I'm going to share with you the things that actually inspired a thought, instead of finding out how the academy approved that idea or like sanitized that idea in a much more academic, flowery way. I'll just be like, actually, this person on Twitter said it a lot more simply. Just look at that person on Twitter's tweet. I hope that's useful.
Thank you. Brooke asked, do you have strategies for fat people dealing with their own internalized fat phobia?
Oh, yes. Yes, I do. In our roundtable, we talked a little bit about turning in towards ourselves and towards our inner child. Because what we are often not told is that even when we're in our 20s, which I imagine a lot of you are as students, we carry with us these like younger versions of us into adulthood. So that like 11-year-old version of you who was told at the dinner table, no, you can't have a second cupcake, but your other cousins are allowed to because they're not fat like you. That we actually need an adult now, just like we needed an adult then, to tell us that that was wrong and that it's okay for us to also have a second cupcake and even a third and a fourth and a fifth if we wanted. And we kind of need to become that adult for ourselves because we still might not have an adult like that in our life. I know that I don't yet have an adult like that in my life. And so I've had to become that adult for myself. And so I think it's really important for us as fat people that in order to grapple with the way that we are constantly taught that our fatness is bad, diseased, should not exist, should be eradicated, we have to actually have an internal dialogue. We need to have this like kind, tender adult to tell us and like hug us. Like I will literally hug myself when I'm sad, and I'll like cuddle my face, and I'll like let myself cry and get down when like someone says something really mean, and I will tell myself the thing that I need to hear, which I wish an adult would hug me and tell me that what they said was wrong, that your body is perfect the way it is, that your body is beautiful the way it is, and that I wouldn't change an inch on your body. And, I imagine what I would tell my best friend when she's having a hard body image day. And I would tell her that her body is perfect, that like, I love hugging her body, and that I would like bite on her little arm fat if I could, because I just love it so much. It's just so perfect the way it is. I think we need that. We also need that internal, we also need a part of us, not just that's tender and sweet, but like a protector. We need like a mama bear to come out and be like, no, doctor, you're not allowed to treat me like that. And no, best friend, that's mean the way you said that to me. And I need you to treat me nicely and kindly, the way that I treat you. So we need tender parts and protector parts. I hope that helps.
Thank you. I have to say that Adriana said that if you don't have a podcast, you should, because they would definitely listen to it. And then Brenda, I'll just say for everyone, it looks like we've got about 3 questions in the chat, and then we'll just wrap up there to be mindful of time. So Brenda and Adriana asked kind of similar questions, which you've kind of touched on a little bit, but are there strategies to defend yourself to doctors or healthcare professionals who refuse to listen to your concerns due to your fatness, and tips for how to deal with family and loved ones that project fat phobia onto you?
I love the way you worded that, because it is a projection, right? Whether it's the doctor doing it or family members, they're projecting their idea about bodies onto us. And for doctors, 2 things. One, around getting on the scale. I know for me, getting on the scale was a thing that was really keeping me from the doctor's office. I didn't want to know the number. I didn't want to be talked to about the number. I didn't want the number visible to me. I thought that that would be really not useful for me, because I definitely, and I still do, associate a number with good and bad. And that's my own work to do. But what I do when I go to a doctor's appointment is I'll say, I would prefer not to be weighed today. And believe it or not, I say just like that. I don't say it like any harshly or more assertively. And whoever is weighing me is like, okay. And then we just continue into the room. So the weighing at the beginning of an appointment is actually optional. And it's helpful for us all to know that, because if that's something keeping you from going to the doctor's office or any appointment of any kind, you can simply opt out. The second thing, if you are going to see a medical professional and you want some type of a test or an intervention, and they kind of are like, no, I don't want to do that for you. I don't believe that ache and pain might be this bigger thing that you think it could be. I'm not going to authorize it. You can say, okay, you don't have to authorize it, but I want you to note in my chart that I requested this intervention, this testing, this scan, this screen, and you said that I should not have it. And what will often happen is the doctor will say, oh, well, I don't really want to write that because I could get sued for that if my patient really does have this thing. And so they'll say, you know what, let me reconsider. Here you go. Just go get that test that you want. So those are 2 things that I think are really important. Assertive communication. This is a really big overlap between healing from diet culture and rape culture. When we are taught that our body is not good enough or not good at all, or broken and not healed, we will often struggle with how to defend it and how to protect it. And so assertive communication is a really important way to practice telling yourself that your body deserves to exist and that you're allowed to take good care of it, however you see fit. Dealing with family, I'll just say, I like to use humor a lot, and I like to change the conversation, the topic a lot. So I know holidays are coming. I know I'm going to be around family that I haven't seen in months. And if family gets on the road of diet talk, I kind of will make a joke out of it. So if someone's like, you're putting a lot on your plate, or you're taking a second slice of that, I'll be like, yeah, isn't it so good? Oh, I thought that my aunt really nailed the candied yams this year. Didn't you agree? I'll say it something like that. I'll play it off like it's a joke, like we're both laughing at it. Or if someone says, you're getting a second slice, are you sure you want that? I'll be like, yeah, do you want a second slice too? I can serve you, so letting someone know that we can all have permission to have more than one serving. It's okay. And then changing the topic is another really helpful one. So kind of having in the back of your mind a list of movies, TikToks, books you've read, a podcast you listen to, a meme, literally anything in the world, so that you can quickly take hold of the discussion and be like, let's talk about something that's way more interesting, without even you having to announce that.
Definitely relevant as a lot of people are going to be seeing family soon. And then for our last question, certainly not least, Janica asked, can you talk about the erasure of cultures that embrace fat bodies as racism? So why we aren't generally talking about fatness as Black joy, for example.
This is what is so valuable about Black power and about the way that in the US, anytime we're talking about body positivity or fat liberation, or even feminism, we have to be talking about how Black liberation, how Black radicalism, Black feminism is what has gotten us there. Like I'm thinking of body positivity as well. Like this conversation today was talking about like white supremacy and how white supremacy intentionally works to erase the way that fat bodies are seen as beautiful around the world and are seen as worthy of adoration and desire, and are deeply invested in the production of seeing fatness as bad and diseased, so that we will be more likely to invest in many of the means of reducing our bodies. So in general, we're not talking about fatness as Black joy, because that would be a conversation involving like, or that should be led by a Black person who is also talking about Black feminism, Black radicalism, who's talking about how Black leaders in the US are really important and necessary for shifting the way that white supremacy has taken a grip on culture, on medicine, on science, that as an immigrant who was born here in the US, my parents come from India, my ideas of what's possible in the world could only have existed because of Black radicalism here in the US. Like all the ideas that I've offered tonight also are like rooted in Black liberation, are rooted in Black radical feminism. In general, I feel like we would be talking about Black joy and fatness as like fantastic when we're talking about abolition. Like abolition is very necessary for us to get to a place where fat people can have pleasurable, shame-free futures. And we cannot get there without Black liberation and Native land back and looking at global South feminists on how to get there.
Thank you so much again. This was just so wonderful today. Terry, I don't know if you had any closing remarks, so I'll toss it back over to you.
The only thing I can think of to say is to put another hand up and clap, and also thank you, Sonalee. So much really valuable ways to think about things, and really pushed us to continue our struggles. So thank you so much. Appreciate it. And thank everybody for coming.
It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the 30 or so of us who stayed so late. I appreciate it. And I linked the slides again. Feel free to share with whomever would like them. I really believe in open source access. So like, I don't feel possessive about who has access to those. Share widely.